Hello, welcome to the Hot Pole Studios 2021 tour. Let's show you all around with all the new improvements we made over the last couple of years. Come this way. Hey, so welcome to the studio tour. This is Hot Pole Studios Studio A, the live room and control room as it stands in 2021. We've done a studio update video every few years, and things are changing rather slowly, but they are changing here. We tried to do kind of a roving video, but that didn't come out so well, so you'll have seen a little clip at the start, and I may throw a few clips in here and there. But the main thing here is going to be me talking about what we have and what we've done. So this is a bit of a talking head video, sorry about that, but it's the best way to show you how far we've come and what we do. Now a quick shout out, a lot of this was possible through the support from you guys through Patreon. So thank you very much all the patrons. Check out the link in the description below if you want to help us out with that, because that really helps us to keep the lights on, to keep the tutorials going, to keep the mix streams going, to keep all of that kind of stuff going. Especially the last year and a half we've not had any bands in here, we've not even had any artists in, we've just had to shut down essentially. So this is what we've done after a little bit of a kind of a refit. So let's start with the control room. A lot of the changes are relatively small but big in impact. Like behind me here, you will see this big rack of gear that was not there on the previous video, and there was a mixing desk there. The desk has gone. The old Allen and Heath has been retired. It wasn't a bad desk, but I said a long time ago that I think that mixing desks are kind of redundant and going the way of the dinosaur. I've really got to practice what I preach, so the desk, which wasn't being used honestly, has gone in favour of more space for more operating equipment that I will be using during tracking. Some nice high-end preamps, some nice compressors, EQs, and a big PatchBay. I did say in a video which I've taken down since, because a lot of people didn't understand that I did say PatchBays are pointless for home studios. People seem to miss that and just thought I was saying that PatchBays are pointless. They're not. PatchBays serve a very critical function when you have lots of equipment that needs to be dynamically switchable on a moment's notice without going behind and wiring everything up every time. So I got, is it 4? Yeah, 4 sets of PatchBays down there from Neutrik, and patched in everything, including some of the new converters. There's usually an Arturia Audio Fuse 8 Pre in the rack there, above the Audient ASP A8T and the Focusrite Octo Pre 2 Dynamic, which is probably going to be replaced with something fairly soon. But seeing as though we have the lovely stuff from Audient and Arturia, that's not been a priority to change that yet. But that could happen in the future. One thing that will be new, I think, since the previous video is the Tonehenge over there, which is where all the amps go. Eventually there's going to be some sort of amp switcher in there. For now we're doing it old school, we're just kind of pulling cables out, because that runs into the live room, which I'll talk about in a little bit. But the live room has 2 cables that go underneath, speaker cables that go separately from everything else, and they just feed the cabinets in there as loud as we want them to be. On this side here, you'll just see a screen poking out, and of course you see the TV behind me. That is the streaming PC setup. So that's a 4-screen monster of a setup that has the PC that used to be the old studio computer. So that now takes care of any live streams that we do from the studio, And connected to that are a lot of Blackmagic capture card inputs, so we can have this camera which you see on there right now, which is useful for me checking focus, but also you'll see a camera behind me at the console. That's an old Blackmagic cinema camera, which is, when that's on, feeding into there as well. There are 2 cameras in the live room and 1 in the vocal booth, and they all feed through to that machine. And the sound from the mixing PC, which is the one behind me, also feeds through to there over the Ethernet cables, and that can all go out and separately either be run by somebody else if we're doing a major session, or I can change it remotely from where I am. Now behind me, it probably looks like I've got like a Slate Raven or a touchscreen or something like that. That's very much on purpose, but it's not. It's a 4K TV running in 4K mode, so I can see lots and lots of things on the same screen. And I know a lot of people say, oh, but 4K is pointless, you can't use it because you need to be really close. Well, I am really close to it. I'm sat less than 2 feet away from that screen, and I'm using it as a glorified, huge computer monitor. That's why it's set back. That's why it's at a nice angle. I can see everything on that screen. And so if I'm just using Reaper, I've got loads of space to have a massive mixer window at the bottom, as well as seeing lots of tracks. If I'm doing anything with multiple things, I can have them all on there. I did have 2 screens with 1 above it, or with 2 above it before that. They've all gone because now that it's a 4K screen at the bottom, I've found that I don't need any more, and it was just getting in the way. And so now, I've changed the monitoring setup again. The monitoring setup was using an all-digital system originally with an RME ARC. I still use an RME RADAT card, but that now goes into the Audient Nero, which is right here, which is a really good monitor controller. I did a review for it when it came out, and at the time, I sent it back because I said that I wasn't using a system that worked with it. Since then, I've decided to just refresh the whole thing, and now the system is based around that. So that takes the sound from the master channels from whatever I'm mixing, and is then split out to currently Adam A7X's with a sub 8 underneath here. Just 1 sub 8. I did have 2 in stereo subs, but I've condensed that to keep it a lot more simple because it was overkill, honestly. And I think also that the dimensions of this console, it was making the console rattle a bit. The console is something that we acquired from the BBC when they shut down one of their old film studios. This was from the UK's North West Tonight News, and before that, this was the mixing console that they used on the Red Dwarf set, I believe. So, yes, sci-fi nerds rejoice. And in there, of course, we have our mixing computer, which is rack mounted and is slid underneath, which is a beast. There's no point talking specs about the Mix PC. It's powerful, it changes on a yearly basis. It's keeping up with the Joneses, but right now it's more powerful than I need, and that's the way it's going to stay. So outside of the Adam A7Xs, I've got a pair of studio spares copies of Yamaha NS10s, so they're not NS10s themselves. I don't use them very often. I use them every now and again to check that things are going to translate on a less capable system. I know there are engineers who use them all the time as a living, and fair play to them, but I prefer to go with the more modern, full range solution. And then in the middle, currently, is a tiny little Behringer horrible speaker, which is also fed from a separate power amp. And that's kind of replacing the idea of the kind of the Auratone grot box kind of thing. Now, I do have an idea in the works for replacing that with something that's much more like a real Auratone type thing. But that's a video that's going to come at some point in the future, maybe many months off yet, or if you're watching this a year from now, it might just come out. In the rack over there, I've finally relented and got a 500 series rack. I did get the Midas one. I know a lot of people go, oh, power supply's not as good as others, blah, blah, blah. I found it to be perfectly fine. It's a power supply and a box with some ins and outs. Anyone who's trying to make it more than that is possibly overselling it a bit. I know that a lot of the brands who make 500 series racks add loads of extra features to try and make it more competitive in that way, and that's great, but most of those don't do anything that I need, like mixers in the rack. I just want lots of ins, lots of outs, so the Midas L10 just kind of does that. I know that Cranbourne Audio make a really cool one that's got ADAT in and outs, so it's got all the conversion in them. That's a really cool idea, and at some point I'm hoping to get one of those in here. But for now, I'm keeping it simple. That does what I need, and currently only holds a couple of colour module holders from HRK, from Herc, and that will have a lot more in the future. Above that is some of my pride and joy, the BBC preamps with the 9-band inductor EQs, which are just insane. 9 octaves of inductor-based EQ. Wow. On the right of that, I've got some handmade 1176s that were made by my friend from home studio, my friend Ross. They have been modded so that they actually do 2-to-1 as well as 4-to-1, 12 and 20. And they also do a true stereo link, where a lot of 1176s, they have a stereo link, but it's actually not that great. The reasons complicated, another video for that maybe. Below that is the Cranbourne Audio EC2, which has 2 of their Camden preamps, and I'm going to be doing a separate video on that because that's really good. And that has their cast Cat 5 and Cat 6 system in it, which is very clever. And below that is my favourite unit for vocals I think I've ever heard, which is the Drama 1960, which has a valve mic preamp and then a valve compressor. I think it's an optical compressor in there, and then it's got a pair of those, and they just sound right to me. I know there are also loads of great designs out there, but that's the one that there is some nostalgia. I used one when I was 19 and it sounded spot on, and that's just stuck in my head ever since. Don't mind the mess on the table there, that's for a project that is going to be coming at some point soon, can't tell you much about that. Over there I've got the Arturia Keylab 88 Mark II, that is a wonderful keyboard controller and that's been my go-to now. I've got other keyboards in the room, I've got an old Vatar Studio Logic and an organ over there. In Studio B I've got my other Studio Logic, which is a non-weighted keyboard, which is better for me for like organ-y stuff and synth stuff where you don't want the weight behind it. I don't anyway, I know that more classically trained people do. Over here I've got lots and lots of guitars and basses, and they're all different from each other. So I've got like kind of 80s Shredder Charvel, Telecaster, Strats, 5, 6 and 7 string basses, as well as the usual 4s. Loads of different types of body types of acoustic guitars. So there's lots to go at if you're bringing stuff into the studio and it's not exactly the sound we're after, or we need an extra different flavour to layer on top or something like that. That's why I do that, and that's why that's all covered. In the live room, we have our shelf with all our microphones on. I'm just going to cut to that bit from the tour. It's a little wobbly, but this should explain some of the gear we have. And we have lots and lots of microphones. The mic locker practically exploded. So we turned it into the microphone shelf, and now you can see mics from Slate, Austrian Audio, SC Electronics, Aston, all the usual suspects, your SM57s, your 421s, your D112s, all that good stuff, all here. The old SM7B, you know, the reliable usual stuff, and some stuff that's a bit more exotic. All there. Some of it's been reviewed on the channel, some of it hasn't, some of it will soon, hopefully. Also, there's all those guitar cabinets. We are nuts about guitar cabs here. We've been working with 2 notes for the longest time. I've done impulses now for Ashdown, for Victory amps. I've done some for other major companies, some of which I'm allowed to talk about, some I'm kind of not. But I've been very lucky that people have kind of heard about what I do and started giving me the call. Great. Then of course there's the vocal booth with this really bizarre looking design, which is a very kind of space age technology where there are only certain sounds that can make their way through the holes on the metal on the walls. Then there's acoustic foam behind that. Then there is the proper construction of the walls with the separating floating walls, floating floors. It's got a floating ceiling in the vocal booth. And it's actually got a full floating room in the live room. So the vocal booth is a fully floating room inside another fully floating room. You can be blasting away in there and it will not bleed into the control room at all, and will barely even bleed into the live room that it's in. So that's something that's worth talking about, because I get quite a lot of comments on some of the older videos saying, oh, you've got acoustic foam on the walls, you have no idea what you're talking about. Allow me to explain for anyone who's not seen the previous studio tour videos. Yes, there is acoustic foam on the walls, But this studio was purpose built. This whole studio is floating, so it has a completely floating floor. It's got floating ceilings, floating walls. Everything has been designed for complete isolation. There's the walls are connected in such a way that they float. Then there's an air gap, then there's rock wall, there's an air gap, then there's concrete, then there's another gap. Then on that side it's earth for miles. On that side it then goes into our storerooms, so that it doesn't matter if there's any bleed over there, but it's all incredibly heavy. If you look through the windows, there's a foot gap where there's two separate air gaps and then another row of breeze blocks. And so that means that there's so much separation in here, as well as the full low end treatment, which is absolutely ridiculous but invisible because of the build, that we can have guitar amps absolutely cranked. Like, we can have a Marshall Plexi on full in the live room, and in here we can just about hear, we're aware that there's some sound going on, but you can have a rather quiet conversation over the top of it, and I mean whisper quiet, and still you're aware of it. But we're talking 40 to 50 dB reduction, which is insane, but it's layers on layers on layers. If you see on this little bit here, it's not one door from the control room to the live room, it's two heavy doors with 1/2 inch thick steel sheeting in, with a 10-foot air gap in between them. We designed it on purpose like this, you know. And so, going back to the foam, we found when we were finished with the design, the low end was perfectly controlled, the mid was well controlled, but the top end had a flutter. And so to control that flutter, we put key points of foam just to control the very top end. And this is not the cheap $2 foam, this is the top of the range, completely fire retardant stuff, you know, the heavy, I mean, that's actually, you know, heavier than it looks, that foam, but it's only to control the fluttery top, which it does perfectly. The low end in here, there is a little bump on one side of the monitoring because there's a huge curve in the room, but other than that, we have pretty much the ideal in here because we engineered it that way. So when I'm not here, I'm at Studio B, which is my home studio, and that has enough gear in it that it's probably worth talking about here, because I've got a second Tonehenge and I do a lot of the mix streams from there. So what I will often do, and what I've always done, is I'll have bands and artists in here, we'll track in here because it's exactly what's needed, then I'll go home, look after my daughter, be a family man, and then after bedtime I will do a lot of the mixing and editing and get everything right, and then generally speaking for big releases I'll bring it back into here and do a final pass on the monitoring system. So here we are, Studio B. So here I am in Studio B, which is actually the office in my house. But I call it Studio B because I do actually do quite a lot of mixing work in here. And if I'm contributing to a project and I'm playing on it, I quite often just do the playing here because the studio is about an hour's drive from my house, which is just how it's ended up. So I've made sure that I have enough equipment here that I can do the live streams with the mixing. I can do all the video editing. Obviously that makes more sense to do that from home because you don't really need all the big audio equipment to edit video. So first let's talk about this monster behind me, the triple screened behemoth. I have 3 screens. I didn't intend on getting 3 screens to begin with. I had 2 because 2 screens, especially for video editing, is more productive. As you can see behind me, there's a screen with Premiere and there's a screen with my notes. But recently I found that the colours weren't good enough on those to do accurate colour grading, so I got the ProArt from Asus, which has been amazing. And seeing as though I had the inputs on the graphics card, I just moved them over and just, there we go. So the monster of a computer down there is what keeps all the live streams going. It means that I can mix a full song at the same time as doing a live stream with no hiccups, no problems at all. So that's running a Ryzen 5800X 8-core processor. That's the latest Zen 3 architecture. 64 gigabytes of RAM running at 3600 megahertz, which is a lot. Far more than anyone, in my opinion, needs for audio, unless you're like a symphony expert. But for video editing and some of the animation stuff that I do, that comes in handy. It's got NVMe's up the wazoo and plenty of storage, including all these hard drives that are tucked away behind that little speaker there. I mostly use headphones in here because a lot of the time I do a lot of work late at night, and I have a 3-year-old child who will be sleeping a couple doors down, and blasting sound out, no bueno. So I do have that kind of cheap old Bluetooth speaker there, which I can use to just check things during the day. It doesn't sound very good, but I know it doesn't sound very good, so it's quite a good barometer. And also it means that I can just listen to stuff if I'm working during the day on something that doesn't require sound. So on the desk here is the Audient ID14 Mark II, which is amazing. I've just switched over to something else for the time being until Audient make an 8-channel interface. Please, Audient, make an 8-channel interface. But we move over this side and we start to see some of the really interesting stuff. There's a keyboard, of course, which is connected to this Motu MIDI device, which also controls some of the stuff on Tonehenge. This is Tonehenge for Studio B, and this is something I am really happy with and really proud of. There's still some wires hanging down the back because the wiring isn't quite finished, so apologies if that looks a bit rough. Some of this has only been put in the last few days, but it's complete enough for me to be able to show you and not be completely embarrassed. So the amps, let's start with the amps. I have the dual rectifier Road King from Mesa, which I got from Paul at Zilla Cabs. It was one of his, and as soon as it came up for sale, I've wanted a Road King forever. That is like the ultimate dual rectifier in my opinion. I mean, yeah, now the Badlander's out, but that's a different thing. In terms of the old school Rectos, I think that's the best, but people will disagree, that's fine. On top of that is a 1978 Marshall JMP. It's 2203 100 watt. So it's basically a 100 watt JCM 800, the original JCM 800, from before they even changed the name. And it's been modified. It's got an extra gain stage in, which means it can really crank more than the classic. Although you can take that back down and drive the amp with a drive pedal and you get that 80s thrash sound doing that. There's a lovely pedal board on top there from Marcus Deluxe, which currently has lots of Jupiter effects stuff and a new pedal from Saturn Works, which splits the sound out 4 different ways. Of course, above that is the 2 go-to basses that I use, the Jazz bass, which is modified to death, and an old Ibanez, which I actually keep strung B-E-A-D. So that's for when I'm doing super low stuff at home. I've got the 6-string bass and the 7-string bass at the studio, but if I'm doing low stuff here, that makes it easy. There are 2 more pedal boards down there with stuff from Jupiter and 2 Notes. 2 Notes is the reason this can exist in the first place, because here next to the other amps on the middle shelf are a 2 Notes Captor 8 feeding the Cab M and a Captor X. Those things are fantastic. Everyone who watches the channel knows I'm a massive 2 Notes fan, and I work with them quite a lot. But those can both take 100 watt amps at full blast, and that means that I can have most of these amps plugged into one of those, do all the reamping in here in silence at night, which means that I can do it live on stream with people in bed, and still keep going and doing what I do. One thing that is missing from my setup right now that might change in the future is some sort of amp switcher. Amp switchers just make life that little bit easier by you plug all the speaker outputs of your amps into the one, you plug all the inputs of the amps in as well, and you switch them around. And right now I'm using a rather crude method of amp switching, which is that I have all of the speaker cables hanging out the back, just dangling here with some printout labels on, so I know which one's which, and I turn the amp off in between. Whereas with a switcher, they usually have kind of a nominal load in them, even if they're not load boxes, so that things don't blow up, but I do have to turn things on and off in between. But switches aren't cheap because of the technology involved, so when I finally get around to doing that, that's what I'm going to do. Right now the options are something from Ampete or from KHE. We'll see what happens in the future there. But right now, it's the simple way. So that's our studio as it stands in 2021. We've grown considerably, as you can see. There's a lot more equipment in here. And that's been me doing bits and bits and bits over this whole lockdown period. Now that we're starting to open, because restrictions are starting to lift, you will see more live streams from here. You'll start to see bands, you'll see some very interesting acts, hopefully. And I wanted to thank everybody who's helped make this possible. All the patrons on Patreon who support us, you really do help to make this possible, and I can't thank you enough. So if you enjoy this, help us if you can, please, on Patreon. It really does help. If not, hit the like button, hit the subscribe button, maybe do those anyway. And I wanted to say thank you for watching one more time, and I'll see you on the channel over the next few years. See you later. Hey everyone, that might be the end of the video, but if you fancy carrying on this conversation, we have a Discord server, link is in the description. We're also on Patreon, which is something you can really help us with. We also are on Facebook, Instagram and Twitter at Hop Pole Studios. See you there.